am Sharon Norton, co-director for Europe and Africa for Mennonite Mission Network. And today with me, I have Matthew and Toni Krabill. They are coming to us from Paris, France, from the Paris Mennonite Center there. And they are in their first year of their first term. So they just arrived in December, right before COVID happened. Mm-hmm. And as many of you know, Europe was one of the first places after China that we found out, realized, experienced coronavirus. And so they have lived through a very unusual first year of the first term because of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but also about their work and their ministry in Paris and beyond. So Matthew and Toni, if you could start just by giving us a little introduction to what the Paris Mennonite Center is.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Sharon. We're so happy to be able to be a part of this conversation with you. For the Paris Mennonite Center, North American Mennonites have been involved in ministry in Paris for over 65 years, working alongside Mennonites from France and other European countries in church planting efforts, theological education, other ministries. And the Paris Mennonite Center grew out of an earlier ministry to African students who were living in France. The ministry actually housed students. And out of these joint ministries, several congregations also came to existence in the Paris area, including the church that we attend, Châtenay-Marguerite, which is a diverse congregation on the outsides of Paris. And for the past 40 years, Neil and Jamie Blau, who are longtime MMN workers and directors, the current directors of the Paris Mennonite Center, they will be retiring very soon. Mm-hmm. They've taught in churches and in seminaries across France, Europe, Africa, equipping congregations and training new leaders. So for us, we hope to continue the work that they've been doing in working alongside churches and seminaries and developing Anabaptist theological resources and publications on peace, justice, and reconciliation. But we additionally hope to develop resources from an Anabaptist perspective on interfaith dialogue, Islam, immigration, Christian responses to refugees. And we're also looking forward to building relationships with African immigrant churches here in the greater Paris area, while also strengthening existing ties with French Mennonite congregations. Another big part of our work is working with the Francophone Mennonite Network. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, the Francophone Mennonite Network has been around for over 10, 15 years. And several years ago, they launched a center for the formation of justice and peace. And that is currently in progress and it's being launched. We're looking at piloting the first course in the next couple months on leadership, peace, and reconciliation. So we're excited about that, excited about building that out and seeing who will participate from Anabaptist Mennonite communities in Africa and Europe, as well as Canada, specifically Quebec. So
that will be a big part of our work in the next few years, and part of that will be, as Matthew said, developing resources for pastors, lay leaders, theology and missiology students throughout Africa, Caribbean, Europe, and North America.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. That is a lot of things to be involved in. And yeah, I always enjoy reading your Facebook posts and blogs and newsletters and things like that to hear about all the things that you are involved in and will be involved in. And I mean, first of all, the first thing, of course, when arriving in a new country, Matthew, you already had some French ability growing up as a missionary kid in West Africa. And Toni, you're a dedicated language learner now. So yeah, when you arrived in France, you were doing language study, and then the coronavirus came and there was lockdown. How did coronavirus impact you and your work in ministry and language learning?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, well, like for everyone around the world, right? It's been a strange, kind of bizarre time. We got here, and in January there were widespread transportation strikes, and so the metro system was shut down, and we couldn't really get anywhere. And then in February, part of our main role is actually to learn French, and we're at two different ends. She's starting, and I'm progressing. And so we had 1 month of in-person class. And then in March, then the president shut everything down for about 90 days. And actually, because the French classes went online, we were able to continue to do our French sort of as usual. Obviously, practicing and getting out and being able to do those things that are necessary was impossible. So that kind of threw a wrench into things. And also, we had just started to visit not only the Mennonite Church in Paris, Sharon Norton, but we were also visiting African immigrant congregations, and had just been into a couple. And then, of course, all that came to a halt. And so we've been doing the Zoom thing like everybody else. And in some ways, that gives great access to what's happening in those communities. And on the other hand, when you don't know anyone in those communities, you're not really able to build relationships. So those have been things that have been disruptive, as is the case, for lots of people around the world. We also, at the same time, have been following, even though we're in France, COVID has disproportionately affected communities, Black and Brown communities on both sides of the Atlantic. What's true in the U.S. is also true in France. Communities that are, of sub-Saharan African or North African descent are particularly struggling. And then you add to that the George Floyd death, and then the most recent stuff happening in Kenosha and everything in between. Those issues, obviously, both in America and in Europe are different for historical reasons, but it also ignited a lot of protests and a lot of outrage here for similar issues, because communities that have been colonized and now live in France and feel oppressed and marginalized, those emotions are really raw. And the frustration is at a tipping point, a boiling point. And so that's been another thing that sort of happened within the whole COVID thing that has been on our hearts and minds as well. So those are a few thoughts about time. I mean, I think too, like within that, all that's happened, you do find yourself, it's pretty human to find yourself asking the question, like, why did God bring us to France during such a time as this? Right. When there's so much sort of rupture, disruption, and so forth. And we've often come back to passage in Jeremiah 29 about seeking the shalom of the city and being here, planting ourselves. And in some ways, regardless of whether we live in cities, towns, rural areas, that we're called to be faithful daily where we're at, despite the fact that there's frustrations and fears and hopes and different kinds of things that are all part of our existence every day. And so we've kind of used that as a compass for how we are living day to day and trying to figure out what God is trying to tell us to do and be here. So
definitely more disorienting than a regular first year adjustment. Right. All the things you just named that maybe we don't all deal with a pandemic in our first year of life in a new country. Right. Deal with kind of a racial reckoning like it's happening now. I've been really touched by all the stories from around the world, and thinking also of Paris and Berlin and on, people saying, solidarity with Black Americans. And then, as you were touching on too, just the reality of kind of the African diaspora, there in France. And I'd be interested if you could dive a little deeper into that and how you're experiencing the African diaspora there, how you're hoping. You did say a little bit, but could you just say a little?
Sure. For the past 9 months, we've been learning about, as Matthew was saying, the complexity of France's history as an empire that once had an estimated 30 countries under its control, and the implication for how it relates to its immigrant communities today, especially African migrants. So we've started building relationships with African diaspora community leaders, attending events on migration in France, and learning about the contributions of Africans, Antilles, the word for those who are from the French Caribbean, and African American communities have contributed to French culture. So one thing that Matthew said that I really liked was, instead of taking a tour of the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre, we've toured the Paris Noir. We've spent quite a bit of time with different tours and just even our own time walking through the Chateau Rouge neighborhoods, which is also called Little Africa, meeting with people, meeting young African diaspora leaders and entrepreneurs who are starting businesses and working to create jobs for Africans in that community in Greater France, but also to create jobs and resources for people throughout West Africa. So we've been deeply impressed in the ways that these young people particularly are contributing to French culture. But one of the challenges that not many people know outside of the African diaspora community. So this particular neighborhood, Little Africa, that I'm talking about is within a 5-minute walk from Sacré-Cœur, which is a church here in Paris that about over 11 million people visit that church every year. But they don't know.
They walk through or around the African neighborhood to get to the church, right? So, and
are completely unaware of this African neighborhood and its contribution to French culture and life. So those are some of the ways that we've been spending our time once confinement lifted in really working to get to know the African diaspora community and educating ourselves just by spending time in those communities. We're also learning, one thing that's been very interesting is learning about the connections between the African American community and France, particularly with Paris.
Right.
So we've spent time learning about what's called Harlem in Paris, which brought about a musical renaissance, and learning about how liberating it was for African Americans around the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah, World War II.
Right, who decided to come to Paris and decided to live here just to experience a degree of freedom that wasn't possible for them in the U.S. during that same era. So in a sense, we've been taken back in time in order to learn about a previous era. And even though it's in the past, what we're realizing is that everything that we're discussing, what we're learning, what's in the news, the conversations that we're having with people are so relevant for what we are dealing with today in America, here in Europe, and it's relevant for the church as well. And then in regard to African diaspora churches, we've been learning about them, even though many churches have been closed because of confinement. We've not done as much as we hoped to do, but we've had a chance to learn a lot about these churches and visit some of the churches. And what we've learned that there's a wave of migrants who came to France in the early 1980s, many from Ivory Coast, many from Congo. They came as students to attend universities. They came as diplomats. They came as workers. And for various different reasons, sometimes because of crisis or war or issues in their home country, they decided to stay in Paris. And part of that, many of them came as Christians. Part of that is they decided to start planting churches here.
Mm-hmm.
So this group, starting in the early 1980s, have planted over 400, it's estimated over 400 church plants here in the greater Paris area.
Wow.
And many of them were neo-Pentecostal, so many of those churches are neo-Pentecostal. They weren't necessarily welcome here in France, but they were planted and they continue to thrive. So through their ministries, there's been just an explosion of churches in urban areas and in the suburbs of Paris as well, gathering what people estimate to be over 10,000 people on Sunday mornings for church. So it's interesting because a lot of times what we hear about France is we hear about how secular France is.
And the decline of the church.
Right. The established churches anyway.
Yeah, the established churches, yeah.
Right, but we often don't hear the stories about these 10,000 people worshiping on Sundays in churches all throughout the greater Paris area. So it's been incredible to get a chance to visit some of these churches. We've been tremendously inspired by the churches, churches with 500 plus congregants at the same time. They offer multiple services on a Sunday morning, some services on Saturdays, gathering over 500 for each service. Services filled with young people in their 20s and 30s.
Wow.
Hard to find members who are above 50. It's just incredible. Yeah.
And would they be conducting services in various languages, or is it mostly in French?
They're mostly in French. Yeah. We imagine other churches would probably do it in multiple languages, but yeah.
We both feel like we still have a lot to learn because we've only been able to visit a handful of these churches. So there's a lot more to learn in exploring these churches. But
5 down, 395 to go, something like that.
Right, exactly.
That sounds about right. That sounds about right. So there's just a lot of hope in what we're seeing in these churches. These young people, they're leading worship. They are running the television ministries. These ministries have global reach.
Wow.
So it's been very exciting to get a chance to be a part of these churches, and we're looking forward to in the future being more engaged in what these ministries are doing, getting more involved with the churches, getting to know people, getting to know the leaders, looking for opportunities that, where we can learn from the churches, and if there are ways that we could be of service to them. One of the many ways that we hope that we can help to serve some of these communities is through theological education. Many of these leaders have studied at theological schools like Vosser-Seine and Nogent, and those are schools where, for example, Neil and Jamie Blau have taught for many years, and places where we hope that in time that we will be able to partner with those theology schools as well. So we hope that one part of our work may be helping to develop theological resources that can help these ministries in their global missionary work. So those have been some of the highlights for us in just being at the beginning and early phases of getting to know the history of African diaspora communities, their impact on France, their impact here in the greater Paris area, and particularly their impact on the spread of the faith here in the Paris area and in France.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. So you've mentioned several things that give you hope and inspiration, like the verse from Jeremiah, and seeing these young leaders in the African immigrant churches. Is there anything else kind of in closing here that you'd like to talk about as far as what gives you hope and inspiration?
Well, I think she mentioned a lot of the people. I think the whole notion that you hear different sort of dramas unfolding, that's the one that you hear about is the decline of the church. But what's actually kind of invisible or at least invisible to maybe the white world or to the established church world. Obviously, Africans are not invisible to themselves. They're quite aware of what they're doing. But there's a big disconnect between those two different realities that are unfolding. Mm-hmm. I would say, in terms of hope, one of the things I've been reading a book that came out not too long ago by N.T. Wright called God in the Pandemic. And I just found it really helpful in reframing our own hopes and desires and frustrations and laments in the biblical text. So I just, for anyone who's looking for something to read, I know there's tons of stuff out there, but it's a great text. Mm-hmm. The other image that comes to mind that I've been kind of dwelling on, that sort of has to do with hope, but it's more just sort of about the strange period that we're in, is Nelson Krabill wrote a reflection recently about the tabernacle. And the thing that I've been thinking about a little bit based on what he wrote is that, you sort of have this, the Israelites are enslaved and oppressed in Egypt, and then they finally get this liberation. And then they're in the wilderness, and they don't know whether it's going to be 1 week or whether it's going to be 40 years. And it turns out it's the latter. And they don't really know that. And so there's this sort of sense, at least for me, obviously quarantine and some of what we're going through is not enslavement and oppression. There's no direct comparison there. But there is a certain sense of of confinement, of barriers, of limitations, of what all that means. And then, being de-quarantined and having sort of a new kind of liberation and a new life to look forward to. And so then you find yourself kind of going towards whatever land of milk and honey you think you're going towards. And we all have different things that we're hoping for, whether it's school or whether it's a new job or whether it's, whatever it is. And then, God decides to do the whole tabernacle thing, which is that the cloud is there, and you can't move unless the cloud moves. And so then you end up sort of having to wait, by day and by night, for God to reveal what comes next. And so I kind of feel like this next phase for me, at least it's helpful to think about that, because it really is a lot more about leaning on where the cloud is moving each day, or maybe the cloud doesn't move for the next 10 days. And what I'm called to is to be patient, to trust God, to lament to God when I'm frustrated, to ask for discernment when it comes to what's the next step to take. So I've found some solace and some hope in that, because I don't know whether we're in a place where it's going to continue for 2 weeks, or we're going to be having the same conversation in 2021 at the same moment. And so the wilderness is a real thing. Yeah. And it also has me thinking, just along the lines, the last thing I'll say is that disruption is just, in disorientation is just a part of life. And I think that particularly in Europe, I'm going to make a generalization, but particularly in Europe and in America and in Canada, we've kind of been under the illusion for a long time that that's not the case. When something happens that disorients or disrupts life, it comes as a shock, because we're so used to what we consider stable structures and institutions and so forth. And I think this is a real opportunity to sort of reframe that and say, no, that's a pretty elusive thing that most of the world doesn't have the privilege of living that kind of way. So those are just some thoughts on.
One of the things we talked about was even the process of learning how to communicate in new ways, how to communicate through Zoom, how to communicate through WhatsApp and other programs. And one of the things that, brought to my attention is that people, particularly on the continent of Africa, have been used to communicating in these kinds of ways for a very long time.
Yeah. Like Zoom is new for a lot of people in terms of work life, right? But at our Congolese Mennonite church in Pasadena, we, one of the young adult women who was in her 20s got married by Zoom. several years ago, and she got married in her living room, and we moved to the village where her husband was, and we had the whole ceremony. This was 5 years ago. So some of these new realities are really old realities for a lot of people. We're in a time where full of sort of contradictions and
and many of the churches that I talked about, the African immigrant churches, they have global ministries. So they were already in the process of recording, live recording of the worship services, of people watching around the world, calling into the prayer ministries, incorporating some of those calls and feedback and questions and prayers into the actual service. So even though having to stop holding a Sunday morning church service as everyone is accustomed to is a tremendous disruption. In many ways, some of these churches, because they already had a global vision for their ministry, were better prepared to continue church than many of the rest of us.
It's fascinating. It's like constant losses, but new opportunities, and all the feelings that go along with both of those.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. And I just appreciate all the different things you're involved in, and your ability to communicate with us. So I know where to find you on social media, but could you just share with people listening here, if they want to know more, how can they find you and your work?
Yeah, on Facebook, if you just search Faith on the Move, it should come up. Our pictures are there, Paris Mennonite Center. And then on Instagram, it's the same thing, Faith on the Move.
Okay.
faithonthemove.net.
faithonthemove.net
on Instagram.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, and I encourage everyone to do that. They have fantastic photos, and many of the things they've talked about, the places they visited, you can see photos of those too. So yeah, definitely encourage you to hop over onto Facebook or Instagram. Not that I normally encourage that, but in this case, it's a good reason to get on and look at some informative and inspiring things. So thanks again to Matthew and Toni for your thoughts and your time, for sharing with us.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Sharon.